Good morning. We've got a few more still coming in here, and quite a few out of town this morning. The Casons, I believe, are out of town. The Latinis are out of town with Mallory's grandmother, I believe it is, was having some surgery this weekend, and so they're there with them. The Bartletts are not out of town. They're gone. The Keaches we're supposed to be out of town, but are in town, and we'll be here. We'll be here later, and then there's somebody else I feel like I'm missing. But oh yes, Logan and Catherine. That's the other ones I was missing. They're out of town up in the Indy area today. So let's keep all those in our prayers. Of course, it's good to see Jim out with us this morning. I know his thoughts are probably back in St. Louis with Miss Cheryl, who had successful surgery. Everything went good. She's still recovering. She did get moved to the rehab facility, and they do have probably at least 3 weeks that they're going to be living in that area. So let's keep them in our prayers as they're away for that, and she continues to recover. Anything else I'm missing before we get started this morning? All right, Tony will ask you if you would lead us in an opening prayer, please.
Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this Lord's Day morning. Thankful for you watching over us through the night, allowing us another day upon your earth. Be here with fellow Christians to study another portion of our word. We pray that as we open your word this morning, that we'll have open minds and open hearts to what is taught, find it to be true, and apply it to our everyday life. Father, we pray for our number who aren't able to be here with us this morning, whether they be on the road of travel or home due to sickness. We pray that you will be with them and allow them back at this point in time. We're indeed thankful to see Jim here with us this morning. Pray that you will continue to watch over him, watch over Cheryl. And we're also thankful to have Janet here with us as well as she's recovering from her surgery. We pray that you will watch over us. Pray that everything we say and do here is done according to thy will. It's in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Yeah. All right. So for those of you that hopefully everybody knows that Chuck and Debbie have now moved to St. Louis, but for those of you that don't know, we're going to continue our studies as we have been. So Sunday mornings we're going to continue to the plan is to just continue to work through the Bible. Right now we're in 1 Peter chapter 2 and just continue that on to the end of the New Testament. And then for the Wednesday night class, the plan is to continue finishing out the books of the Old Testament. As we've been doing an overview and and a study of those, we're going to continue to do that. So nothing's changed in that aspect as you prepare for your weekly lessons. We wanted to keep that the same. Now, obviously, we were out of town last week, but I looked back at the video to see where you guys left off, and we're in 1 Peter chapter 2, and the last about 5 minutes, y'all got into 18 through 21, and he kind of was a pretty quick skim over of it. So we're just going to start there in verse 18 because if you look at your Bible, all of this is the man-made sections and verses. It wasn't like that when it was originally written. But you can look, it's divided up into sections here, and 18 is kind of the beginning of a section. So that's kind of where we're going to start this morning and dive a little deeper into it and start in verse 18. So we'll start over here with Tim, if you would. We're going to read, if you would, just read 18 through 21.
Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, for the sake of the conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows of suffering unjustly. But what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps.
Okay. So starting in verse 18 there, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Does anybody have any thoughts on this verse? It kind of contradicts, EJ?
To me, what's jumping out at me is whoever that's over you, that they might not treat you right because they can single you out, or they can dislike you for something, or they can put you in another department that you don't want to do. Just because somebody's doing wrong to you, you don't turn around and do wrong to them. Which is what I read, what I jumped out at. God loves us all like He went to the cross. But then do not have patience, do not have any retaliation, malice, or anything to get that person back. That's what jumped out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we continue on here and get into the kind of the next section, it piggybacks off of what EJ just said with in terms of Christ and his reaction to those that did wrong to him. But doesn't this kind of go against, I don't want to say every fiber of our being, but every fiber of the world's view of things? Is that the typical view of people, is to, oh, you've done me wrong, let me, I'm not going to get you back or anything like that? Amy? Or EJ?
You wouldn't have all of this killing and shooting and disrespect and everything else. You would not have that. You would have people that, to me, somebody can say something ugly to me, and they have. I just say God loves you so glad and walk away from them. They don't have that mentality. You do something wrong to somebody, they want to pull out 357 something. Then you read about them on the news. They have retaliation for wrong parts, wrong, because they don't care about Jesus. That's just it. They don't have Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Amy?
That was basically what I was going to say. It's our instinct, like people's instinct is to, if somebody's mean to me, well, I've got to step back and say something back mean to them and hurt them worse than they've hurt me. Or, oh, they're not helping me out. Why should I help them out? Or, you know what? They're going to cut my hours. I'm not going to show up.
So why do we think that's the case? Let's talk about that for a minute, because there's always a root to every problem. So why do we feel that? Because even as Christians, I know. So it's our tendency to kind of want to defend ourselves, and not necessarily defend ourselves, but to stand up for yourself. And when you feel you're wronged, to do wrong. And Amy mentioned something there about being hurt. I think the one time in my life, and I hate to say it, but it's been a couple times in my life where I felt kind of the silliest with this aspect is, you ever stubbed your toe or hit your funny bone on something, or had an inanimate object hurt you? I've been there before, and I turned around and I just kind of out of frustration hit that object. How do you think that went over? Well, then my hand was hurting. And I just kind of, once I kind of calmed down from it, I thought that was about the silliest thing that I could do, because then it hurt me twice. But it's kind of a thought process there to think about. If you retaliate to that person, if someone does wrong you and you retaliate to them, does it really do you any good? No. What's it kind of do?
You gotta watch your back.
Right. So it
puts you on the same playing field.
Puts you on the same playing field, but how often does that person go, you know what, like that inanimate object? How often, if I stub my toe on this podium and I hit the podium, how often does that podium go, you know what, I really shouldn't have gotten his way and forced him to stub his toe? Does it do any good? No. But not only that, is that podium still going to do the same thing next time I, short step it right here and stub my toe? Is the podium going to do the exact same thing? Yes, it accomplished nothing. So if somebody does something to me and I retaliate against them, a lot of times what does that do to them? How often do they look at it and go, you know what, I shouldn't have wronged Matt like that. I was wrong in that. I'm not going to do that again. Is that the norm? Or is the norm that they now have a tendency to retaliate back to me because now I've wronged them? And it's just this constant cycle that you could get into with somebody of going back and forth. And then next thing you know, you don't even know what you were originally mad about in the first place. Like, how did they originally wrong you? Because there's been such a long chain of the two of you butting heads over, what's transpired between you, Janet and Trey.
And this time, I mean, there was like a huge population of slaves. So, and Christian slaves too. So, that's the reason for it. They say, you take your punishment and and you take it patiently. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
I mean, probably maybe more slaves than there were Roman.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, fortunately we live in a world where we ourselves aren't very familiar firsthand with slavery and the acts of it. But you're exactly right. Like, they were, enslaved and forced to endure these things. Trey?
Yeah, I was gonna kind of piggyback on what that was Janet was saying. We're not talking about relationships between two people that are on level playing
Right.
here.
Right.
We are talking about people who are supposed to be submissive. And may that have been as a slave or as us today, someone who is probably technically our boss, who
Yeah.
we're supposed to be submissive to. And if we look back in Ephesians, it says, in sincerity of heart, not with eye service, doing goodwill and doing the service as to doing the will of God from the heart. And that's back in Ephesians 6.
I actually had that written down here to flip over to
Right.
and read.
I think it's really important that we can keep that fear and that respect of somebody that we're in submission to, which is probably our boss. And unfortunately, they're not all going to treat us well. And they don't always treat us well. We have the opportunity to quit if we don't like it, or we can stay and be submissive. You're going to have good and gentle, and you're going to have some that are harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the fortunate thing that for us, we don't have that slavery aspect today. So there are things that we can do to kind of counteract that and get out from under that, because a lot of times it is a boss or a superior, and there are other options out there. And we have a duty to also, for ourselves, do something to change that. Like, we have that ability. So if we don't want to endure this, if we don't want to continue living under that, we can do something about it and move to something else. However, we shouldn't react the negative way, like it's talked about here.
So be respectful.
Right.
Regardless.
Absolutely. You ever heard somebody talk about, getting ready to quit a job and they tell their boss off, or yell at their boss, leave on bad terms? That again, it goes back to, there's nothing good that's going to come out of that. Like, you go for another job, who are they going to call? They're going to call your old bosses, your old references. How do you think that's going to go? And so the plan that's laid out here for us of just persevering through it, striving through it, that's the key aspect to it. Denise?
Also in Colossians 3:22, kind of plays into it, says, slaves in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So it's not necessarily just the outward appearance. It's got to come from the heart on it.
Right. No, absolutely. And you can do your job. You can be friendly to somebody on the outside, but not actually have any meaning behind it, not want to. And it's, it talks about that it's wrong to, even if you do it, to do it for the wrong reasons. You have to have the right reasoning behind it as well. All right, anything else on 18 there? Tim?
So you mentioned that goes against every fiber of our being as a human. But
Right.
as a Christian, it should go towards every fiber of
Yes.
our being as a Christian, and that's where sometimes we try to draw that line between, well, in this situation, I don't consider myself. I'm not focusing all the time. When we lose focus of being a Christian all the time, and we think we're just a human like everybody else, that we work with, that's when we get caught up in, joining in the bashing of the boss or joining in those kind of things, where we lose track of, okay, I'm a Christian first, right? It's not
Right.
like most of the time I'm not, and then when I come here, I'm a Christian, right? We're Christian all the time. So the fiber of our Christian being should be,
Right.
so it should be more the opposite, that it's very rare that I fall into this. Not the other way, that
Right.
I'm always having to fight this.
No, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible is the one that talks about not being of the world. We have to be in the world, but not of the world. And, it's difficult, because where do we spend the majority of our time? In the world. The majority of our time is not spent here in these four walls with fellow Christians. Now, we need to strive to fellowship with one another outside of here to help keep strengthening that bond. But the fact of the matter is, most of our time is spent around non-Christians in the world. And to Tim's point, that's where it does get difficult. We have to remember that even though the majority of our time is spent out there, we still should have the same beliefs, the same values, and the same actions as we do when we are in here towards everybody, not just other Christians, but towards everybody. All right, looking at verse 19 here. For this is commendable if because of conscience towards God one endures great suffering wrongfully. If you would look over at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And Janet, if you would read verse 10 for us there.
Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
So we're talking here again, those that are wrongfully persecuted, those and they're talking to Christians here. So those that are wrongfully persecuted, where is their reward? Heaven. So, blessed are those, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's where our reward is going to come. We're going to endure a lot of things in this life, and there's a slim to none chance that you're going to go through your entire life without ever having any sort of issues come up regarding your Christianity and someone mocking you, making fun of you, persecuting you. And I hate to use the word persecution, because when we think persecution, what do we tend to think of? Physical beatings, the things that we read about here in the New Testament, prison, death, that type of thing. But is persecution just physical? No. So we're fortunate that we don't really endure those physical persecutions, but we still endure persecutions. And it may be something because of work. It may be something from the world, but we have to endure. And as we see here, those that are enduring, those Christians that are enduring and suffering these things, they'll get their reward in the end. It's not going to go unnoticed by God. It's not going to go unnoticed. They will get reward for it and their patience in the end. Dave?
Godly people back during the Roman Empire were persecuted very severely physically. Today, we suffer persecution a lot mentally, because family is one big thing. If they want you to participate with them in something that's not right, then you've got to stand up for your Christian principles and not participate in them. So, a lot of times we suffer persecution that way from our own family.
Yeah, absolutely. It can come from anywhere. It can come from friends. It can come from work. And to Dave's point, it can even come from family, where you're with them, they're not living the way they should, and they may you may receive blowback as a result of that. We unfortunately see it happen all the time. Trey?
And we need to understand here that we're looking at it only from an American point of view.
Right.
You're not going to suffer that kind of persecution or our kind of persecution in North Korea. You are going to physically feel it. So it's different throughout the world. It can still be very much like it was.
Yeah, absolutely. There are still Christians that physically suffer, and that comes to mind for me time to time, where there are two things that I think about. I have so much respect for people that didn't grow up in the church. I was brought up in the church, and I know a lot of people weren't, and I sometimes battle with myself that if I wasn't raised in the church, would I have had that drive to find the truth like so many of us here, so many people here have done. There's a large number here that they weren't brought to church all growing up and sat in Bible class and learned and studied. And I sometimes question and maybe somewhat worry about, would I have the strength to do what a lot of you guys did? And it's the same thing with this is, we're fortunate here that we don't have that physical persecution. But if we were somewhere else that did, would I have the strength to stand up to that? I mean, you know how it makes you feel sometimes when people mock you or make fun of you, and how we sometimes cave to that as Christians. What kind of strength would I have if somebody was threatening my life or threatening prison or something like that? Would I have that strength? Would I have that faith and courage to withstand that, Tim?
As
the children we have, or when we remember when we were children, think it's not fair, right? And then as we get older, as a parent, we say that to the children. Well, they say it's not fair, and we say, well, that's the way it is. Kind of
Life's
thing.
not fair.
Right, life's not fair. But as a Christian, sometimes we're serving God like we should, and all the things just are not going well. And that's where, as a Christian, we've got to be conscious of not saying, complaining, doing those kind of things where we're giving in to, overall persecution, overall things that are not going right with our lives. But this life is not our goal, right? Heaven is our goal. So you take all those things into consideration, consider it as worldly persecution when things aren't going well, whether it's financially, health, or whatever. We can't complain. We've got to stay the course, like this says, towards God. We're doing it, for God, for that reward.
Yeah, absolutely. And who's a great example to look to for that?
Christ.
Okay, that's the easy answer, Christ. Yes, but I was thinking Job. So you look at Job. Job, I think, to me, Job is the one that I feel like us as Christians, as Americans, can relate to the most. Because here's a guy who had it all. He had friends. He had good, had family, had kids. He was wealthy, and didn't, we don't really read of him having any persecution, and he was still faithful to God. And so it's a pretty similar life and lifestyle to what we here in this country live today. But then he had it all taken from him, and not like gradually over time. Within a matter of, one person would come up and tell him something was wrong, and before he could finish talking, the next person would come up, and before he could finish talking, the next person would come up. So you're talking in a matter of probably less than an hour. This guy went from wealthy, having it all, to having lost everything, having to completely start over with nothing. But how did he deal with that? And even having family, his own wife telling him, just give up, just curse God and die, like end this, get it over with. Like, when you want to talk about having everybody against you and every circumstance that could go wrong for you, it's Job. No question, it's Job. But to Tim's point, he stayed strong through that. And us, as Christians, as citizens of this country, where we have the opportunities that we have, we can't let the slightest thing throw us off track. But unfortunately, sometimes it does, and we have to put that in perspective. With even when things are going rough for us and going bad for us, in comparison, do we really have it? Do we really have it that bad when we look at other people in the world today, but also, the people we see in the Bible? And I feel like I say it every time I'm up here teaching. It's not a coincidence, the things that found its way to the scriptures. Like when you talk about the thousands and thousands of years that this earth has been around, why did Job's story get plucked out into its own little thing? It doesn't fall under the Israelite kingdom. When you look at chronology, it falls more towards like the Genesis era. So why did that one story get plucked out? Well, does it not fit perfectly with what a lot of people suffer today? So, when this was put together and designed by God and given to us by the Holy Spirit, it wasn't a coincidence, the things that found its way here for our learning. All right, looking at verse 20 here. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently, but when you do good and suffer, you take it patiently? This is commendable before God. So let's look over at Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, and we're going to read 32 through 34 here. Where did we get to? Okay. If you would go ahead and Luke 6, 32 through 34.
If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same thing. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive That is in there.
All right. So, kind of the flip side, looking at the other way, how easy is it to be nice to those that are nice to you?
Easy.
Yeah, it's not that difficult. Not that difficult of a chore. And even talking here about, lending to those that are good to you, you're going to get, you do that a lot of times because you expect to get something in return for that. But the thing to me that's kind of when you're reading this particular verse, the twist of the knife, so to speak, that really sticks at home is the fact that it says even sinners do this. Even sinners are nice to people that are nice to them and lend to those that have credit. And it's equating us and putting us on a level with sinners. That if that's our mentality, that we're only going to be nice to those that are nice to us, are we really different? How should we be in comparison to the world? Different, set apart. And if that's all we do, we're only nice to those that are nice to us, then we're not any different than those that are of the world and those that are sinners. All right. Flipping back over to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. That you should follow his steps. So look over at Matthew 16, if you would. Greg, if you would flip over to Matthew 16. Trent, if you would go to 1 John chapter 2. And then when you get over there, Matthew 16:24, whenever you're ready.
And Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wants to come with me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me.
All right, take up his cross and follow me. And you can see here, verse 21 is fixing to lead into the rest of the chapter here, which I hope to get through by the end of this. Take up his cross and follow me. What does that mean? Anyone seen somebody with a physical cross running down the road? I have a couple times seen somebody with a physical cross, and he had attached a wheel to the back, so the back, as he was dragging it, had a wheel on it, but it's not something you see every day. So is that what that's talking about here? Hey, EJ?
What jumped out at me is you can't serve to pick one.
So you can't serve two masters, you gotta pick one. Amy?
I mean, it's not a literal cross. It's our metaphorical persecutions. It's whatever our punishments or our persecutions are. We still have to carry those, but we have to behave in the way Christ did with it. We have to carry it.
Right.
We can't throw it back on somebody else.
Yes. So there's apparently a few people out here that have interpreted that as literal, and I think it's twice I have seen that. Where somebody was carrying a literal cross, but that's not what it's talking about here. Like we shouldn't all come in here and stack our crosses by the door and then pick them up as we leave again. It's talking about the things that Christ suffered. His cross was his suffering. His cross, the death that he died, and we'll talk more about that here in the coming verses. It wasn't just. It wasn't something that he deserved. That was his cross to bear. And keeping with kind of the theme here, we're talking about those that are unduly harsh to us, masters that are unduly harsh to us, and even looking, to the one-on-one relationship, people that are unduly mean to us. The persecution is our cross to bear, and we should bear it just as he did. Tim?
I go back to verse 20. If we do right, which we should be doing as Christians, and we suffer for it in this life, we should patiently endure it. So, how long are we willing in this life to patiently endure what we have to put up with on this earth, right?
Right.
I mean, it should be our entire life, right? And hopefully we're patiently enduring that, right? We don't want to be impatiently enduring that, right? Complaining and, about this cross, telling other people, oh, you don't believe what I have to bear this time. That's not patiently enduring it, right? Patiently enduring it means here's the goal's here, and it's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint, right? So we don't know when the end is, right? The end is when our life ends, so we don't know when that is individually. But when it comes, we want to have borne our cross, whatever those things are, all the way to the end and not give up.
But life is so long, Tim. That's an awful long time to put up with.
Well, that's what we
With
take
this type
one
of
day
thing,
at a
isn't
time
it?
and 1 hour at a time, and other than what we're doing right here, we can't really affect 5 hours from now, right? We may not have it.
But if I live to be 100, man, that's a long time to really put up with this stuff, right? Yes, and I'll get just 1 second, Jen. Yes and no. So I had a teacher one time that described it as this. So we think as humans, we have this tunnel vision. Like we can't imagine God with no beginning and no end. Like everything we know in this life has a beginning and has an end. And so for us as humans, it's really hard to comprehend that. So we look at life, somebody that lives to be 100 years old, what do we say about them? Oh, they've lived to be a ripe old age. They've had such a long life. And we look at how long that is and how long we may have to endure these things, this suffering, this punishment. But when you look at it, this is how he described it. So you live to be 100. There's your life. And then he took the marker, it's chalkboard, and went all the way around, drew on the wall, that fell off there, and went all the way around the wall. He's like, this is eternity. So we look at the suffering that we may have to suffer 100 years. We look at 100 years, man, that's a long time to have to suffer these things. But what did we just read when we take up our cross? Where's our reward? It's all of this after this line. So in reality, is that much suffering? Trey and I had the opportunity yesterday to do the Rugged Maniac up in Paoli, and it was suffering. Going up and down the ski slopes 3 different times, it was look at me. It was not the most fun thing I could have done. Not that good. Hopefully that's not permanent. But it was an hour. I think it took us like an hour and 40 minutes to complete. But the feeling after complete and coming up some of those hills, it was brutal. Like it was legs are hurting, your back's hurting, your lungs are somewhere down at the bottom of the hill. It was not fun. But at the end, when you finish, that feeling of accomplishment, that feeling of I just did it. And as we were going yesterday, we had a group of us that did it, and they're like, "Going to do this again next year?" I'm like, now is not the time. As I'm coming up this hill, gasping for air. Now is not the time to ask me, "Hey, are you going to do this next year?" Let's wait until I've had 24 hours to sit on it. And now somebody asked me this morning, like, "You think you'll do it again?" Yeah, I would do it again. But you can ask Trey. Yesterday, that would not have been my answer. But that little bit of suffering, it was worth it. It was worth it. And that's how we have to look at this stuff we're reading here. The suffering that we went through, it's going to be worth it because eternity is going to go all around this wall, out the door, down the street, and just start making laps around the world. That's what eternity is going to have for us. All right. Getting into Trent, 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, please.
Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did.
1 John 2. Oh, you're right. Never mind. Sorry, I was looking at chapter 1. Sorry. Yeah, so we have to live as Jesus lived. That's part of that taking up our own cross, our own metaphorical cross, and living that life. All right. I would like to get through the end of the chapter, so whoever has class next week can talk about wives and submission to your husbands, and I don't have to do that. So, verse 22. McKenna, you want to read for us? So 1 Peter 2:22, and then we'll go through 25, and if you'll just read 2 verses, and then Denise can read the rest.
Who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, for by his wounds you were healed.
For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls.
All right. Brian, if you would open up to Isaiah 53. But nobody could guess that we were going to go over here and read this. All right, if you would, read Isaiah 53, 7 through 9 there.
He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before his shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who would declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
Okay, and David, if you would, open up to Luke 23. We'll be there in just a minute, Luke 23. So, what do we see about, Isaiah? What was he known as? He's a prophet, but what's his kind of he was the what prophet?
Oh, yeah.
Somebody said
Messianic.
the Messianic prophet. So his prophecies, a lot of them were about the Messiah. And that's exactly what we see here. And some of that kind of closely mirrors what we just read, that no deceit was found in his mouth. He committed no sin. What was Christ's punishment for? What had he done to deserve this? Absolutely nothing. David, if you would, read Luke. Wait, where'd I go? Luke 23 and verse 46.
Now, and then Jesus cried out with a loud voice. He said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last.
Okay. So this right here is the very last part of Jesus suffering on the cross. Throughout the whole thing, and including the last bit here, we already established that he didn't deserve what he got. But what was his reaction? What do we read in Isaiah? What do we read here in Luke where it ends? What's his reaction? He didn't say anything. He let it happen. He suffered that suffering, and that's why it's the perfect example for us as to how we ought to be today. We already talked about, we here don't have people putting us to death. We don't have people coming in and throwing us in jail and persecuting us like others in the world do and like Christ suffered. But at the same time, all the more so, we should have the ability to hold our tongues and to just put up with the... And like I said, I hesitate to use the word persecution because it has such a physical connotation to it, and that we don't have that here. But it is, it is persecution in its own right. So if he was able to suffer through that, shouldn't we be able to kind of just, as we've been talking here, take our hits as they come? Looking at verse 24, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes we are healed. Look up, Chris, if you would go to Hebrews chapter 9. Brad, if you would go to Romans 7. And Steve, if you would go to Isaiah 53. So Chris, whenever you get over to Hebrews 9, if you would read verse 28.
So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation.
Okay, so this is kind of a continuation here, looking at the suffering that Christ went through, the things that he went through, and that he took it. And we see why he took it. He took it for us. He took it for our salvation, so that we can have that hope. Brad, Romans 7 and verse 6, please.
But now we've been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter.
Okay. So why do we have this hope of after this? What's the whole reason that we have this hope? Who's the whole reason? Jesus. The death that he died, the suffering that he went through for something that he did not deserve at all. And then, Steve, if you would, Isaiah 53:5.
But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed.
So, who would you be willing to suffer for? I would not have been willing to throw Trey on my back yesterday and carry her up one of those hills. I might have, if we had a team effort, might have been able to do that. But, who would you be willing to suffer for and to go through suffering for?
Well, typically it's somebody who you would think would appreciate the sacrifice. When Christ went to the cross, knowing most people would reject him and not even appreciate what he did and what he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kicker. Is I've thought about Cheryl that just went through getting the liver transplant, and there are certain parts of the body that you can give to somebody and have another one or have it regrow. And let's just use the liver for an example. How willing would you be to give a liver to somebody if you knew that as soon as they got it, they were going to go start drinking and just wear it out as well? How willing would you be able to do? Again, let me just preface, that's not Cheryl. I'm not talking about Cheryl there. But how willing would you be to give a loved one's lungs to somebody that was a chain smoker and you knew was going to continue to do that? Like, how willing would you be to give a part of your body to somebody that you knew was going to reject it, abuse it, not care about the sacrifice that you made for them? We wouldn't do it. Like, that's not something that we would do. But that's exactly what Christ did. Christ knew ahead of time that the majority of the people were going to reject the sacrifice. The majority of people were going to reject him, yet he went ahead and made that sacrifice on our behalf anyways, so that all men have the opportunity to do it, even knowing a majority of them are going to reject it. Final thing here, verse 25. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. If you would, flip over to Ezekiel chapter 34. And Warren, if you would read just before Daniel. Ezekiel 34. Yes, sir. Ezekiel 34 and verses 23 and 24.
I will establish one shepherd over them. He shall feed them. My servant David, he shall feed them, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David has heard the Lord.
Okay, so we read here in 1 Peter, we read about all we like sheep have gone astray. By his stripes we are healed, and that he's returned to be our shepherd and overseer of our souls. But here in Ezekiel, who did it say was going to be our shepherd? David. How is David going to be our shepherd? He's dead.
It's through David's line that Jesus.
Right. So we actually talked about this in the high school class a few weeks ago. This was through David's lineage was Christ, and Christ we see in 1 Peter. Here's the fulfilling of this prophecy here in Ezekiel, that he is from David. So this is how David is our shepherd Christ is our shepherd. He's the overseer of our souls. All right. So next Sunday we'll pick up in 1 Peter chapter 3. Everybody be prepared. Be prepared for that. Thank you, everyone, for participation this morning.